The Dragon Awakens. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of the Hong Kong studio, staining the wooden floors a soft gold. Bruce Lee was sitting in Siza, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and deep. The air around him seemed to vibrate with an almost palpable stillness, as if time itself had slowed down to match his meditative state. It was then that the door opened with a bang. An immense man, with shoulders as broad as a bull and arms as thick as tree trunks, entered with heavy steps. He was a karate master, known for his brute strength and explosive temper. His 220 pounds of muscle and swagger filled the space, making the studio seem suddenly smaller. He looked at Bruce with disdain, lips curling into a sneer. "You?" His voice was a guttural growl. "The great Bruce Lee? I heard you teach martial arts, but look at you. You're too thin, too weak. How can you call yourself a fighter?" Bruce didn't move. He didn't open his eyes. He continued breathing, unperturbed, as if the man hadn't spoken. The karateka snorted, irritated by the indifference. "Get up. Let's see if your techniques are as good as your fame." Still in no rush, Bruce opened his eyes. His gaze was calm, but there was something there, an intensity that made the big man hesitate for a moment. Slowly, he rose, his movements fluid, almost feline. The karateka crossed his arms, expecting an immediate attack, but Bruce just stood there, watching. "Do you want to fight?" he asked, his voice calm. "Then fight." The karate master needed no further encouragement. With a scream, he launched himself forward, his right fist flying towards Bruce's face. It was a powerful blow, capable of knocking down an ordinary man with a single impact. But Bruce was no ordinary man. The instant the fist approached, he dodged it with an almost imperceptible lightness, as if the attack had passed by him without touching. The karateka, unbalanced by the force of his own blow, staggered forward. Before he could recover, Bruce pivoted on his left foot, his entire body turning into a compressed spring. And then, the kick. It was so fast that you barely saw it. A blurred movement, a dry crack in the air. Bruce's right foot struck the karateka's chest with surgical precision, just below the sternum. It wasn't a brutal blow, it wasn't a bone-crushing attack. It was a masterful touch, enough to interrupt the flow of energy, to destabilize the giant. The 220-pound man flew backwards as if he had been hit by a train. His body hit the wall with a thud, and he slid to the floor, eyes wide, breath catching in his throat. For a long moment, only the sound of his labored breathing could be heard, like a broken bellows. Bruce walked over, kneeling beside him. "Strength is not in size," he said, his voice still calm. "It's in precision. In economy of movement. In the mind that controls the body." The karateka tried to speak, but only managed to cough. When he finally caught his breath, there was no longer any arrogance in his eyes. Just respect. "I've never seen anything like this," he murmured. Bruce smiled, extending his hand to help him up. "Now you know why they call it art." And with that, the dragon returned to meditating, leaving behind a transformed man, and a lesson that would echo for generations. Dragon's legacy. The days that followed were of silence and reflection. The dojo, once the scene of demonstrations of brute strength, has become a sanctuary of discipline. The karateka, who was now just called Kenji, came back every morning, no longer to challenge, but to learn. Bruce watched him from afar, allowing humility to do its work. There was no rush. True mastery was not rushed. But not everyone accepted the change. One night, while Bruce was training alone under the light of paper lanterns, the dojo door opened violently. 3 men entered, dressed in dark kimonos, their faces covered by cloth masks. The leader, a tall man with scars on his arms, raised a short sword. "The Dragon Master," he said, his voice full of venom. "They say you humiliate warriors. That you teach weakness disguised as art. Today, we will see if your philosophy survives steel." Bruce didn't move. He just breathed, feeling the weight of the air around him. "The sword is an extension of the arm," he replied, calmly. "But the arm is just a tool. The real combat takes place here." He touched his temple with his finger. The leader laughed, a harsh, joyless sound. Fine words for an unarmed man. The blade cut through the air. Bruce dodged at the last moment, feeling the wind of the sword brush his cheek. There was no time to think, only to act. A roundhouse kick hit the attacker's wrist, sending the sword flying. Before the second man could react, Bruce spun, using the attacker's own momentum to knock him down with a precise blow to the throat. The third tried to escape, but Kenji, who had entered silently behind them, intercepted him with a punch to the stomach, followed by an armbar that pinned him to the ground. The leader, now unarmed, spat out blood. "You're fast. But speed doesn't win wars." Bruce walked over, picking up the fallen sword. For a moment, the man thought he would be killed. But Bruce just examined it, running his fingers along the edge of the blade. "A weapon is as deadly as the hand that wields it," he said. "But a trained mind doesn't need weapons to win." He returned the sword to the man, who held it as if it were burning. "Go. And think about what it really means to be strong." The intruders left in silence, leaving behind only the echo of their hurried footsteps. Kenji looked at Bruce in disbelief. "You could have killed them." "It could." Bruce crossed his arms. "But death is easy. Living with the consequences of your actions, that's the true test." The last teaching. The years passed. The dojo flourished, not as a place of violence, but as a refuge for those who sought more than muscle, they sought understanding. Bruce has aged, his hair now gray, his hands marked by old scars. But his eyes remained clear, as if he still saw beyond the obvious. One afternoon, as the sun was setting over the mountains, a young man entered the dojo. It wasn't like the others. It brought no questions, no challenges. Just a deep stillness, as if he already knew what he was looking for. Bruce watched him for a long moment. "Did you come to learn?" The young man shook his head. "I came to understand." Bruce smiled. It was the right answer. "Then sit down. And watch." And so, the dragon taught his last lesson, not with words, not with blows, but with silence. He showed the young man how the body moves effortlessly, how breathing becomes a dance, how the mind, when trained, can see the entire world in a single grain of sand. When night fell, the young man stood up, bowing in respect. "Thank you, master." Bruce just nodded. "Now go. And teach what you learned." The young man left, taking with him not just techniques, but a philosophy. And Bruce finally closed his eyes. There was no fight. There was no pain. Just the peace of a man who had fulfilled his purpose. Outside, the wind blew through the trees, carrying with it the echo of an art that would never die. Dragon's legacy. The young man walked for days, crossing dense forests and rugged mountains, until he reached a village where hunger and violence had set in like plagues. The villagers lived under the yoke of a warlord who exacted tribute in blood and grain, leaving them on the brink of ruin. When he saw him arrive, a frail-looking man, some laughed. Others ignored him. But a child, with big, curious eyes, approached. "Are you a warrior?" he asked, touching the empty scabbard of the young man's sword. He smiled, remembering Bruce's words. "I'm an apprentice." And he started teaching. Not with swords, not with blows, but with subtle movements, like the wind between the leaves. He showed them how to get up after a fall, how to take a deep breath before acting, how to find strength in silence. The villagers, suspicious at first, soon realized that it was not magic, but something deeper, the art of living without fear. The warlord, however, did not tolerate peaceful resistance. He sent his men to crush the rebellion before it grew. When they arrived, they found the young man standing in the center of the square, surrounded by unarmed peasants. One of the soldiers raised his sword, ready to attack. "You're going to die for nothing," he growled. The young man did not move. He closed his eyes, felt the wind, heard the rhythm of his own heartbeat. And when the soldier advanced, he didn't block the blow, he just dodged it, like water around a stone. The man stumbled, unbalanced, and fell to his knees. The other soldiers hesitated. They had never seen anything like this. "Kill him!" shouted the leader, but the men no longer obeyed with the same conviction. One by one, they lowered their weapons. Some even knelt, recognizing something greater than brute force. The furious warlord advanced personally. He was a huge man, with scars that told stories of battles won. But when he raised the club to crush the young man, he found only emptiness. The blow passed harmlessly, and before he could recover, he felt a gentle pressure on his chest, the touch of a hand that didn't push, but guided. He fell onto his back, stunned. "How?" The young man reached out his hand to help him up. Strength is not in destroying, but in understanding. The warlord, for the first time in years, felt ashamed. He left the club on the ground and left, followed by his men. The village was saved without a drop of blood spilled. Years passed. The young man, now a master, traveled to distant lands, teaching the same lesson, that true martial art was not about winning, but about finding balance. Some called him wise. Others, crazy. But everyone who knew him knew one thing: he carried with him the spirit of a dragon that he once chose to teach rather than destroy. And when, one peaceful night, he closed his eyes for the last time, there was no pain. Just the wind, whispering through the trees, as if saying, "Now, rest. Your purpose has been fulfilled." The legacy of the dragon who taught. The years that followed the warlord's departure were peaceful, but not without trials. The village, once marked by the shadow of violence, flourished under the master's wisdom. Children learned to breathe before reacting, adults learned to listen before judging. However, not everyone accepted that philosophy. A young warrior, the son of one of the men who had followed the warlord years before, arrived at the village with fire in his eyes. His name was Kale, and he carried with him the scar of humiliation. His father, once feared, had returned home broken, without pride, without purpose. Kale had grown up hearing stories of how a man of words had stolen his clan's strength, turning them into shadows of their former selves. "Are you the master who poisoned minds?" asked Kale, standing at the entrance to the square, where the old man was teaching a group of children to move fluidly, like water between stones. The master looked up, serene. "I don't poison. I just show that there is more than one way to be strong." Kale spat on the ground. "Strength is breaking bones, not whispering like a poet. My father was a lion. Now, he's a lamb." The master didn't move. Lions hunt alone. Lambs live in herds. Which of the two survives the winter? The response was a punch. Kale attacked with the fury of someone who knew no other language. The master dodged, not with speed, but with precision, as if he knew exactly where the blow would land. Kale attacked again, and again, and again, until his fists bled and his chest burned. The master did not retaliate. He just stood there, breathing deeply, as if the young man's every movement was a question he had already known how to answer a long time ago. When Kale, exhausted, fell to his knees, the master approached and placed his hand on his shoulder. "You fight as if pain were your enemy. But it's just a mirror. It shows you what you still don't understand." Kale expected hatred, but found only compassion. And something inside him cracked. Years later, it was Kale who found the master in his cabin in the mountains, old and frail, but with his eyes still glowing like embers. The ancient warrior now wore the same simple clothes, and his body bore the marks of decades of teaching, scars that were not from battle but from falls, from hands calloused from holding those of stubborn students, from sleepless nights beside those who needed a guide. "Did you know I was coming?" asked Kale, kneeling before him. The master smiled. "I always knew. You were like me, once. Full of questions that only life could answer. Kale lowered his head. My father died peacefully. He said he finally understood what you meant. That the Force wasn't what he thought. The Master closed his eyes. And you? Do you still think I'm crazy? Kale took a deep breath. I think the world needs more crazy people like you. The Master laughed, a light sound, like leaves in the wind. Then my work is done. That night, as the fire crackled low, the Master told Kale the story of the dragon he had once chosen to teach rather than destroy. He spoke of how, in his dreams, he still heard the roar of the beast, but now mixed with the laughter of children who were learning not to fear their own shadow. He spoke of how true victory was not over others, but over the part of himself that insisted on seeing the world in black and white. When dawn arrived, the Master was quiet. Kale thought he was asleep, until he realized his breathing had stopped. There was no agony, no struggle. Just one last breath, as if he had been waiting for that moment to finally rest. Kale buried him at the foot of the mountain, where the wind sang among the rocks. And when he turned to leave, he took with him not only the Master's words, but something deeper, the certainty that strength was not in winning, but in knowing when to stop. The dragon had not disappeared. It had just changed shape. And so, the lesson continued. The weight of absence. Kale descended the mountain with a lighter heart than he imagined possible. The Master's words echoed in his mind, but now they were his, no longer someone else's teaching. The dragon that had haunted him for so long was no longer a beast to be defeated, but a part of himself, a shadow that, when recognized, was no longer a monster. However, the peace would not last. When he arrived in the valley, he found the villages in flames. They were not the natural fires of the dry seasons, but voracious flames, fueled by human hands. Armed men marched between the houses, looting, burning, killing. Kale recognized the banners, the same coat of arms he had seen years before, when his village had been reduced to ashes. The warlord, Lord Vaith, had returned. He could have moved on. He could have hid in the mountains, as he had done before, and let the world burn without him. But the Master had taught him that strength was not in winning, but in knowing when to stop. And there, in the face of destruction, Kale understood that stopping also meant acting. The choice of the sword. Kale was no longer the boy who fled the massacre. Nor was he the warrior who sought death in meaningless battles. But he still had his hands, his sword, and an anger that he now knew how to control. He moved through the shadows, fast as the wind he had learned to hear. He cut the ropes that held prisoners, opened gates, guided families to caves on the hillsides. He did not attack the soldiers head-on, that would be repeating the mistakes of the past. Instead, he used the terrain, the fire, the darkness. It made every step of the invaders costly, until doubt settled in their ranks. Lord Vaith, a man in black armor and scars who told stories of cruelty, noticed the resistance. He ordered his men to hunt down whoever was responsible. Kale let them get closer, just enough for them to see his face before disappearing again. "You," growled Vaith, when they finally found themselves face to face, among the ruins of a house that was still smoking. "The boy who lived. I thought he had died." "I died," Kale said, his voice calm. "I just didn't know it at the time." Vaith laughed, a harsh sound like scraped metal. "Then die again." The fight was brief. Kale didn't seek victory, just what was necessary. When Vaith's sword broke against his, when the Lord fell to his knees, panting, Kale did not raise the blade for the final blow. "Why don't you kill me?" Vaith spat out blood. "That's what I would do." "Because I'm not you," Kale replied. And he left him there, alive, humiliated, but not dead. The end of the war. Vaith's soldiers retreated at dawn. Without their leader to inspire them, their bloodlust faded. The villages, although injured, began to rebuild. Kale didn't stay to see. He wasn't a hero, and he didn't want to be remembered as one. But before he left, he found a child hidden among the rubble, a wide-eyed boy, holding a broken wooden sword. "Are you leaving?" asked the boy. "Yes." And who will protect us? Kale looked at the sword in his hand, then at the horizon. Yourselves, he said at last. When they learn that strength is not in winning, but in knowing when to stop. And so, without speeches, without glory, he was gone. The dragon that never left. Years later, stories were told about a man who appeared on stormy nights, helping lost travelers or guiding herds away from gorges. Some said it was a spirit. Others, that he was just a man who had learned to live without fear. Kale never confirmed nor denied. He knew the dragon hadn't disappeared, it had just changed shape. Now, instead of a beast that chased him, it was a constant presence, a reminder. Sometimes, when the wind blew strong, he would close his eyes and listen to the laughter of the children who were no longer afraid of the shadows. And smile.